Learning with iDigitalpreneur, and let's discuss an important CSS property by the name of background, which is what the name suggests. It is used to provide a background to any of the HTML element that you have added. So let us begin the video. Now, as we already discussed that the background property is used to provide a background to any of the HTML element that you provide. And a background could be any of the four things which I have mentioned here. It could be a solid color, any of the colors. It could be image or images. You can have one image or multiple images as part of your background. And you can also have linear, radial as well as conic gradients. We'll discuss what these are, but basically it's a combination of different colors in a particular sequence. Linear essentially means that it is a linear sequencing of colors. Radial is you'll get this circular sort of an effect, and conic is something which gives you a conic sort of a are different things you can do with the background property, and we'll discuss all of them. And the background property is essentially a shorthand for all of these different individual background properties. Now, ideally, whenever you're writing your CSS code, you would probably want to segregate out your properties. So instead of applying the image and the color in the background property together, you individually write background color and background image so that you have a much more greater clarity over what all different background properties you are adding to your HTML element. But the background property, in short, can apply or can be used to apply all of these individual background properties in your CSS code. Now, enough of the Now, I have my index.html open up, and I have created a section which has a paragraph inside of it. And you can see this is what the section looks like. So I will first of all start off by applying some basic stylings to the section, and then we will go ahead and apply the background property to it. So I want to define a height of, let's say 600 pixels, and I want the font size, the font of the paragraph, to be of 2 rems. And I also want to apply a padding of 1 rem. And I also want to apply a border to the section. So 1 pixel of solid black to it. And now my section is pretty much ready. Now let us first start by applying a background color, and you can simply write background and then specify the color, for example, red, and this will change the background color to red. Or you can write background hyphen color as a standalone property, and then you can go ahead and define the solid color for which you want the background to be applied. So I will go ahead and probably add aquamarine, and this is what my section's background now looks like. Now, in order to apply any gradient or image, you need to use another CSS property called background hyphen image. And as you can see, all of these individual standalone properties are part of the background CSS property. So for the background image, let's start off by first defining a linear gradient. And linear gradient, you can specify multiple colors. So let's just start with random colors and say that I want a linear gradient starting from red, and then it goes to yellow, and then finally it ends with blue. And now once I save this, you can see that we are getting this nice gradient from top to bottom. So it's starting off with the red at the very top. At the very middle, we can see that yellow color. And at the end, I'm seeing that blue color. Now, if you want to change the direction of your linear gradient, you can specify the direction into which the linear gradient will go, and you need to specify it at the very start of your linear gradient. So even before defining the color, just define where your linear gradient should end. So let's say I want my linear gradient to end at the right. So for that, I will write 2 space right, comma, and then all of the values which I will apply will be the colors of the linear gradient. So by writing this, now you can see that the position, or rather the direction of my linear gradient has changed. My gradient is going to the right, So essentially it starts off from the opposite of right, which is left. Similarly to right, I can go ahead and say to top, and it will start from the bottom and go to the very top. I can also make it in the corners of my HTML element. I can say to bottom right. So it will start off from the top left and it will go on to the bottom right. As you can see, this is what is happening. It starts from the top left and goes to the bottom right. So I can specify all of the 6 directions, or rather 8 directions in my HTML element, and then I can add in n number of colors. I can keep on adding more colors. Let's say I add aqua and I add black as well. So there is no limitation to the number of colors you can add. And now you will see that you can play around with the values to kind of get the correct output. But this is what linear gradients are all about. And linear gradients or any gradients are part of the background image property and not the background color. If you apply linear gradient to background color, it will not work. So now for linear gradient, we can also use radial gradient. And radial gradient, we don't use the direction because radial always starts at the very center of the element. So now you will see this funky looking gradient. It starts off with the red at the very center, and then the sequence of the colors are maintained. So it goes from yellow to blue to aqua to black and all of that. Similarly to radial gradient, we have something called conic gradient. And now it looks like you're looking at the top of a pyramid and the colors are distributed accordingly as part of the cone. So these are the different gradients which you can use as part of your background image. Now, in order to add an image, which is the most common use case for background image, you use the background image property, but instead of using the gradients, you use something called a URL. And inside a pair of quotes, it could be single quotes or double quotes, doesn't matter. Inside a pair of quotes, you specify the path of the image which you want to add in. So I already have an image here by the name of trees.jpg, which I'm going to use. So I will say, and this again follows the same pattern what we used with anchor tags and image tags to kind of specify the path of the asset. So I will say trees.jpg. And now when I save this, now you can see that the image has been applied. Now, although this is not the full and final image, some part of the image, or rather most of the images is actually cropped. Now we can control the position and the clipping and everything of the image using the different background properties that we are going to see now. So the next background property which I'm going to use is called background size, and it is basically used to specify the size of the background image, whether it could, like, it should be stretched out across the entire HTML element or it could be contained as part of the original image. So let's see what all of different properties are available. In background size, the default is auto, and once you do this, you can see that there is no difference in the image whatsoever. Now I'll go ahead and use the contain property. And once I go back, now you can see that the image is contained inside of the HTML element. That means the image will not be cropped if you're using background size of contain, and the original image and its aspect ratio will be maintained. But now we have run into some problem. We can see that there is a repetition of images. This image is getting repeated n number of times, and this is the intended behavior of background. Whenever the background image does not fit the dimensions of any HTML element, the browser automatically repeats that image as part of fulfilling the entire dimension of the image. So because this image was smaller in size, to kind of compensate for the entire size of my section, it repeated the image. We can fix this using another CSS property, but just so you know, this is the intended behavior of background images. And the final property is cover. Cover essentially scales out the entire image, and it does not matter whether the aspect ratio of the image is preserved or not. It just makes sure that the image is scaled across across all of the width and height of the image. So if I do this, now you can see that the image has been scaled out and the clipping of the image also occurs. So ideally, you most of the times you will be using an image and you will be using the background size of cover. So make sure that the image that you're using is always maintaining the aspect ratio of the HTML element itself so that you get the complete picture. Now let's change it back to contain and let's try to fix this repeating issue. So we can use background hyphen repeat, and now we have couple of different options here. So the most common one is no repeat. No repeat essentially means that don't repeat the image on the x-axis as well as on the y-axis. So now you can see that the repetition of the image has been made to 0, and the background color which I mentioned here is also present. And this is a good tip that you can follow, that in case your background image does not load, the browser should always fall back to a background color. And I have done this here as well, that in case my background color, in case my background image is not loading, it will fall back to a solid color. Now I can also make this back to repeat, and it will be the same thing what we saw earlier. So this is what background repeat does. There are other properties which you won't be using very oftenly. The only repeated properties that you use are background repeat and background of no repeat. So moving on, the next thing which I would like to discuss is the background position. And background position basically defines where the image, from which point does the image like where do you define the image position, where is the actual coordinate of the image. So if I make this to be 30 pixels, now you can see that the image actually shifted 30 pixels to the right. So that means it is positioning the image inside of the HTML container, inside of the HTML tag with which it has been associated as a background image for. So you can specify any values in pixels. You can also specify background position of top left, top right, top bottom left and right, and you can also specify it in pixels. It essentially tells you the initial position of the background image, right, where the image should basically start off. And there is another property called background origin. And background origin tells you where, from which point onwards the background origin should start. And this has some properties of padding box, which is the default behavior. Now padding box essentially makes sure that the image is inside of the padding itself, so the image does not cross beyond the threshold of the padding of the HTML element. You can change this to border box, and it will kind of stretch outside of the padding area of the HTML element itself. And then there is another called content box. This is the same thing what we have with the box sizing property, and that is what the background origin property does. And finally, we have the background attachment property, and it is used to kind of determine the position of the image, of the background image, with respect to the viewport. Now you can make this to be fixed, and now once you do this as fixed, the image will not scroll along with the entire page. And to prove my point, what I will do is I will write in some paragraph outside of my section. And now you can see, or let me just make this more verbose. Let's add a paragraph with 300 words in it. And now you can see that the image is fixed, but my page is scrolling. So if you want to have this parallax sort of an effect, and you have put in a background image on all of your body, and you don't want the image to scroll as the entire page is scrolling, what you can simply do is you can use the background attachment to be fixed. Similarly, the default behavior would be scroll, and it would scroll with the page scrolling as well. So as and when your page scrolls, the image will scroll as well. And then there is another called local. Now local is essentially dependent on the parent element itself. So if you have put in a scroll for your parent element, it will scroll according to the parent element, but it will not scroll according to the page itself. So these are the different background attachment properties. Most of the times you will go ahead and use the fixed property if you want to achieve that parallax sort of an effect. But mostly background attachment is not used very oftenly. The most commonly used background properties would be background color, the background size, the background repeat, the background position, and this mostly you will be using as background as center. It will center the image in the very center of the HTML element. This brings us to the end of the different background CSS properties. You can play around with the properties, try to apply different values and see how your image is getting spanned across inside of the HTML element. And I will see you all in the next video.